te horongo te hetina, te horongo te hinina, te horongo te Tewe Eru. Puturi no waikari papatoki te papatoki te pōtoro utoro tai. Karanga mai, karanga mai, karanga mai. Karanga mai, te wharihui e tūnei, te wharitawhito. Karanga mai, karanga mai, karanga mai. Karanga mai e te rohi o ranana, karanga mai. Karanga mai o nā taonga, te tepu te nā taonga, te o tawhito, nā taonga, te tupuna. Ko rananui koe o te haura, ko papatu nuku koe te waiu, ko tāne koe te tai au, ko rongo koe te hua. Ko tanga roa koe a rehu tai koutu koe o te Māori o hoi whakaarara. E nā mautoronga, pōro oro haki nā reo tani kau haki te māpa mo tia, au e, ui e, tāi ki e. Karanga mai, e nā rini mate, haere e ne mate. E hirini, e tūhoi mamau kai, mamau taonga, mamau tangata ki te pō haere. Haere, e hirini. E kai tui, kai puoro, kai waiata, e haere ho, haere. E hirini, he takutua kana haere ho, haere ki te waikinui, waikiroa, waikipama. Mau haere. Karanga mai e nei ui o tēnei whare. Karanga mai e nei ui e nei hau e whā. Karanga mai, ai te raupu o nā te ranana. Karanga mai. E whakarongo taku kōrero o te mahi, te whakatangitangi o nā taonga pūro. E te pake waitara, te pūra akau, e te mahi o te whakatangitangi o nā taonga. Nā reira tēnā koutou ka whua. Yeah, I'm sure you're beginning to wonder if I would ever speak in any other language. It behoves me, particularly as a pink, ageing Pākehā, European male, to pay deference to the taonga that I work with and introduce them to new areas and new places. And that's what that was all about. It was a way of introducing these living people to the past, those who have passed before, and to people here tonight, hopefully finding something of interest in this presentation tonight. I usually start now, as I get older, with a little housekeeping message. I taught for 37 years, so I know all about housekeeping messages. And the staff meetings in the morning, you sit there and they grind through these messages and so on. But the one I want to mention is, in fact, I very obviously have Parkinson's. Now, I'm not after a vote of sympathy, you get on with it, you do what you do, but I do want to mention that because part of my Parkinson's is a tremor, and I had an epiphany 2 or 3 years ago with a group of children working and making an instrument, and part of the making of the instrument, little tube, little flute, was they don't get their finger holes until they can make a sound. So I sent them off, and away they went, and about half an hour later, a young Māori girl came back and stood in front of me, and I said, "Do you think you can play?" She said, "Well, I'll try." Now, this wasn't the instrument, but she raised the instrument to her lips, composed herself, and then began to play. Now, it was totally serious. She wasn't taking the mickey out of me. What she was doing was, in a very, very acute way, was observing what I was doing. Now, why I'm telling you that is within 10 minutes, if I had let that carry on, within 10 minutes I could have created a new tradition globally. And everybody that you see from now on playing. And other kids saying, "That's not how you play. This old fella, this is what this, he's a bomb, he knew what he was doing." So a little something to start with there. What I am doing in my own idiosyncrasies now is not the traditional way of playing. It's very still, very composed, and of course the sounds are very beautiful. Interestingly enough, if I pursue this line, Parkinson's and the brain is a very mysterious thing, because by and large, as I stand in front of audiences now, having tried to eat my food and going in all directions, I can step out in an audience of 10, 20, 30, 20,000 and play as well as I've ever played in my life. Something happens and I'm basically, the brain is hardwired and I play. Anyway, enough of those personal stories. I am counselled by my wife frequently as I leave the house don't, and it's usually done with clenched teeth, don't talk about yourself. Okay. A little bit of background, and I know we've only got an hour, and I find that just far too short to say anything sensible, but here I am. We have some members of Naiwi Māori here tonight, and I'm very pleased and thrilled that they're here to support me. Māori, of course, are the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. These instruments that I talk about and play, they are the custodians and guardians of that whole tradition. I'm just I'm a mokai, I'm a slave that works with these and have been doing so for the last 50 years. Very quickly, the traditions of these, and I believe them to be very profound and beautiful and melodic and an extraordinary function. The missionaries from about 1815 on arrival to bring the new word to the savages and to the barbarians saw in one instance, in the instance of these, that in fact these seem to play a very distinct and crucial role in the spiritual life of any traditional Maori community. So in their thinking they thought, well, if we can take this plug of traditional musical performance, pull the plug on that, we can deflate this body of belief. I think they were quite surprised at the depth and layering of the cosmos of the people, and scratching their heads a little as to how to get an inroad into the Christian word and bring it to the people. So they saw this as one way of deflating that balloon of belief. And of course, with the arrival of all of the blandishments, the baubles of civilization, a number turned away from traditional practice and leapt very much into modern practice, clutching the Bible. There also were ways in which traders and thieves, in fact, traders and others moving through the country collected the instruments, and you have a very beautiful collection in the Pacific Room in the London British Museum, as there are in many museums around the world. So they lost an instrument, they lost something to play, and if you haven't an instrument to play, then that tradition is lost if you no longer remember how they're played. What else perhaps is equally important, perhaps more important, is that when you look at this and it has these exquisite design features here, these aren't just pretty pictures, these aren't just some images, they are highly symbolic, and they are actually your archives, they are your encyclopaedia, these are the Windows 1823. This is what you referred to. Now, if you take this away, nobody's got anything left to play. If you take this away, you've got nothing left to refer to, and that's what these are. These aren't just designs. These are your histories, these are your archives, this is your information bank. And people were very skilled at reading these and remembering. So the loss of instruments the loss was responsible for two ways of knowledge being lost. And of course another way was if you've got a community of 200 on the Hokianga, which is a harbour up the top end of the North Island of New Zealand, which is where missionisation happened early, and a ship comes in that's got carrying a couple of people on board with the flu, you've got a community ashore has no resistance whatsoever. In 2 weeks they've got the flu, and in a community of 200 you might have 30, 40, 50 deaths, just like that. And of those 30 or 40 or 50, you might have 2 or 3 knowledge keepers in the community, and within 2 weeks you've significantly lowered your knowledge base just by the arrival of these infectious diseases. Other things happened. You couldn't cut the voice away. They can certainly stop you playing these, but you couldn't take the voice. So singing continued, and the song form is glorious. It's called Motiatia in its widest sense, and I'm told there are anything up to 8,000 to 10,000 texts out there in some collectible form or other. Only several hundred can be sung now, sadly, but it is a huge and powerful tradition, and I believe it to be the main culture bearer. That in fact, if you wanted to remember, you sang, and that is a very indigenous way. And in fact, I think of pronouncement of a minor prophet, you could call him, Matiaha Tira Morihu, down at Moiraki, And in his retelling of the creation chant, in a very loose translation, he said, "In the long night, the dark night, the everlasting night, the gods sang the universe and world into being." Sang. And when you think about the Greeks, when you think about a whole lot of other cultures, the music of the spheres, tuning yourself to the earth and so on. Music is hugely powerful as a memory hook and memory catalyst, and it also makes up the body of knowledge in a very acceptable way. Other things happened. The singing continued, but in a different form. The people in the late 19th century became the greatest singers of hymns on earth, and still are. And SATB colonised the mind. By that I mean, of course, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and they still sing. Anybody here from the Mormon community? They are such great singers, they virtually fall out of the womb singing SATB. That's their life, they sing. But these are a much more rarefied thing and much more limited in their use. The whole instrumental tradition seemed to have been largely the preserve of what we call the taonga. He's the religious adept, or she, the religious adept, the priest, however you want, whatever name you want them to use. They are the shaman. And these wonderful instruments were their toolkit. And largely they seem to have been, can I find it? No, it's a speaker. I do a very crass thing here by finding my cell phone and holding up. These you could regard as a cell phone to the divine. All right, they were the connecting thread of sound between Ida Tangata, the temporal world, and Ida Atua, the spiritual domain. And it was the tohunga was the agent mediating between those two worlds, which is also why the wider community, pretty frightened of all this stuff, didn't like it, couldn't explain it, stayed pretty much clear. So it further put these instruments into a realm of restriction. They frightened the general community, and if they heard them, they knew some serious business was underway and underfoot. Is this all making sense? It's a very wordy introduction, but I feel you need to know some of these things before I get onto these. And about 9 o'clock tonight, I'll really get stuck into them. But I should say it is a real pleasure to be here, and given the journey getting here, you're lucky to have me at all. I had no instruments for 36 hours, having left Istanbul. They all went somewhere, I don't know where they went. But it's fairly frightening, and more importantly, I had no clothes, I had no money, not a broken instrument, but broken cases and so on. And in fact, I can put it all at the feet of Lufthansa. I lost a whole lot of luggage on the way to Chile a year or two ago to work in Bolivia. And I mentioned it to the porter in the hotel that we spent a night in Chile, in Santiago. He went, "Oh, land Chile? Oh, common as the breath of God." I love it. Common as the breath of God. Okay, now just killing my wits. There is a lot to talk about and a lot of contextual things placed in there. So suffice to say that they had large function, largely spiritual, I believe, and there's a bit of a controversy about the wider general use of these, but they largely accompanied song or were the private practice instruments of the tohunga, this religious adept. They put the prohibition on it, the restriction of using them and playing them, and we come into the 20th century silent. In relation to the instruments, silence. Nobody knew how to play them, nobody knew anything about them. The whole knowledge was gone, and in fact that's reinforced by someone like Peter Buck, who was a great Maori scholar, and in his book on the coming of the Maori published in 1949, there is a chapter at the end of, there's a chapter on musical instruments. The last paragraph is, "Sadly, these beautiful objects will be forever mute." There was no intimation that the sounds would ever come back to us. Anyway, myself, Hideni Melbourne, and Brian Flintoff, the kind of three musketeers, in our independent way in about 1957, 58, 59, we each evinced an interest. Hideni's is well known, legendary, because it's been turned into 3 or 4 versions of a song, but he says looking at museum items in a glass case, if I put my lips to your lips, what would the sound be? Neither Brian or I can be as poetic as that, but essentially we were all three of us looking to see if there were sounds left, and how, if there were, how did you make them, what did they sound like, etc., etc. We all came together in various ways at a hui, largely at Aotearoa in the early 80s, and the rest is history. We started reconstructing, we started talking to old people, we started visiting museums and measuring, we started looking at private collections, we started travelling in the Pacific and further afield, and so it has been. And now it's a little hard to approach anything much in the art world in New Zealand without these unique voices being in there somewhere. Who saw Once Warriors? They're in there. Who saw Lord of the Rings? They're in there. Who saw Whale Rider? They're in there. Goes on and on. Pretty much anything, any involvement with New Zealand film, those voices are in there. And in fact, many of the objects on the table right now are the ones that sang. This object here, which I won't play in here, partly because it brings the rain and also it's dangerous. This is what you heard in Once Warriors. Every time that Jake the Muss worked up a head of steam and mindlessly hit people and thrashed people, this puririhu is the sound you heard. And I could just deliver a sermon and a homily here for about 3/4 of an hour about the misuse of cultural objects, but I won't, because it's a brilliant sound effect as well. And those are the ironies of artwork in the 20th and 21st century. There's no way around it. It was a brilliant sound effect, and it's in the heads of people right around the world. In another way, this is the voice of the mother. Its shape is female. It's a summoner of tears. It's actually, one of its names is Te Reo o Ngā Whaia, the voice of the mothers. And that's exactly what it is, and it's to be used that way in Once Warriors is completely off the track. See, I could deliver in 1 minute if I tried. The homily's over. So, one of the things in coming to terms with these is you've really got to give away the Western tempered tyranny of the tempered scale, because it doesn't work in those ways at all. Maori music largely works in four pitches, tones, and what gives it its element, what gives it its power, what gives it its extraordinary strength is the microtonal movements with and between notes. And we're not used to dealing with those. Microtonal work usually means we're hearing something sharp, or we're hearing something flat, and it's all painful. And which reminds me, a friend of mine, Andrew Tracy, learning to play the tabla, went to a tabla player who was also a carpenter, and his first lesson was with the hammers and things, doing the pitching and the tuning. This is the way you hit to make it sharp. And then he rephrased it. He said, no, that's not right. This is the way you play it here to make it flat. No, that's not right. This is the way you play it. And he completely forgot everything. So sharp, blunt, pitch and so on. It was a very extraordinary story. So 4 tones and a compression of melodic material that takes a bit of getting used to. My only kind of corollary I can think of that, those of you that have your first time listening to classical Indian music, it just seems you can't do anything with it, you can't process it. And in some ways this whole Maori area too is so specific and has such meaning in the microtonal work that you have this floating universe. I work in China quite frequently, and I tell these kinds of stories and so on. And I have a bevy of young women for the next several days. They're so keen, and they've been selected out of thousands. There's such positivity, and they all follow me around like a group of little calves, pushing and shoving, and you go. And then one will push forward and say, oh, Mr. Richard, where is Middle C? And they have this problem of a floating world of pitch that they actually can't cope. It's chaos, and it threatens them. So we have a bit of trouble with that, and in actual fact it's easily answered, because it seems to me that the lead singer, the person who stands, and of course the singing is very different also, and I know Keri Te Kano is Maori and sings opera, but the lead singer in any community will often stand, male or female, and they crank up like a farm machinery. Once that point is hit, the ropu behind, the group behind, then swing in on that pitch. So in fact, you are within a narrow area. You are controlling the pitch that suits you, and are not reaching into your pocket and getting a tuning fork going bang, and then everybody tunes and so on. It just doesn't work like that at all. So it's a fascinating thing, and I think that's probably the best explanation I could give. There's so many things I could tell you, but anyway, putatara. It's what I started with, and it's really out of order here. It's one of the trumpets in the family. There are trumpets made from very beautifully from wood, and I have several at home, but how can you travel with 5 and 6 and 7 foot trumpets when it's hard enough with these? And this is only a very small representative selection. I work with about 100, and they all have such subtle, beautiful voices. But I'll mention this in case I forget. It's about as large as a conch. I'm trying to think of the Latin name of this, but it'll come to me. This is about as big as ours get. Pacific have huge shells, and we have now a tradition in New Zealand, and the Waka boys on the Thames earlier this week may well have had big putatara. And without seeing them, I'd put $5 on, or £5, shall we say, on the fact that they're probably Pacific conches that some rally brought home from the Pacific Islands or Philippines, and they've been turned it into a putatara, maybe drilled a hole in the side, maybe cut the end off, but very few cultures, only Shinto that I know of, only Tibetans and Maori have very elaborately fashioned mouthpieces. And those of you that play brass will know that it gives you stability of attack for the lips, and in fact allows you, with the longer tube, allows you to create some of the harmonic pitching and the other note sequences that are available to you. With the big shells, they make a very big, deep voice, but they go nowhere. You got one note and that's it. So that's the putatara used for signalling. A lot of the early observations were very unkind, rude, boring, painful to the ears, obscene carving, on and on and on and on. And in actual fact, I think they're very musical. You can actually play the rangi of some very old motitia. Intensely musical instrument. The other thing that's available to you, of course, is you're utilising this over here, which is like the koawa, which I'll be talking about in a minute. Right. Now, the literature would have you believe, virtually in everything that's ever been printed, except recently, that in fact as I told you, great singers, of great resource and artistry and so on. But they had very few instruments, and what they did have was simplistic and hardly, or not worthy of study. Well, of course, the work we've done here seems to have changed all that, and there is a wide sound world that is available to the players of these. Only one lack, only one omission in all of the instruments, and that is any kind of skin membrane drum. And yet they had the name. Pahu came from overseas. They had the example of the Rarotongan drum traditions, which is profound and exciting. And most other Pacific Islands had slit drum traditions. The name came, the instrument didn't. And it's not as though Maori are unrhythmic or unrhythm based. They are profoundly so, but different. Very different. And in fact I had another epiphany with a Ghanaian drummer that came to stay. He'd been at the Wellington Festival, which is between the two islands, international festival, and he'd just come straight over, and it had been storms, and he was a star man as well. He had star knowledge. He said, can we go and have a walk outside? I haven't been out, I haven't seen the sky. So we walked, and it had been raining as well, but dripping water and so on, and then the moon came out, and he just stood there and he said, I know drum, I know the drum. And there is no drum here. He was intuiting something from the landscape that suggested to him that there was nothing of the rhythmic type drums that he was such a master at. He'd done 21 years, I think, as an apprentice. And it was a very interesting epiphany, if you like, that he intuited that there was nothing of what he knew as a drum tradition, which I've always thought amazing and quite extraordinary. But there were many instances of of percussion. Here's some of the more extravagant. This is the pan bone, the jawbone, the lower jawbone of what we call pilot whale. Some people call blackfish. It's a globicephala. I know all these because I've had to get permits to bring these around the world. And you wouldn't believe how hard it is to have a whalebone move. Even the customs people don't know what you're asking. You put out the documents and they've never seen them before in your life. Go to the boss. Boss goes. And then wants to show that he's in control. This is, I might add, Frankfurt. And gets a huge stamp. And boom. And then it turns the page. And boom. Comes up to the desk finally and says, "Where's your seat?" I said, "I've been working with these permits for 3 years with all the authorities. I don't know what you're talking about." "Well, who do you work for?" And I said, "I'm a self-employed musician." "What is worth?" And I'm no good on my feet arguing. I said, "Oh, they're priceless," which is true. And the final act was wonderful. I got to show you. He came up to the counter, put it and rested in. Everything has its price. Anyway, he then knew he was stymied and sent me on my way. So there's a lot of pitches and tones in here. These kinds of instruments, known as tumutumu, were essentially found, meaning the taonga would go out and see objects that he could use and turn them into percussive instruments like these. I think I can identify about 9 different gradations of pitch. But in fact, there doesn't seem to have been high use of polyrhythms and so on, and more orthodoxly would have probably sounded something like. I'll stop it there because it goes on for about 3 hours, and any devotees can see me afterwards. So that's the tumutumu. They were made from stone and bone and were sung with, mainly in terms of the knowledge we used in what was known in the south as the Wharepurako, the house of the learnings, the house of stories, and that monotonous metronomic sound was what accompanied it all through the night. Practically from first frost to last frost. Another more austere percussive instrument, and I've really only brought the spectacular ones with me, is an object like this. In New Zealand we have a very spectacular nephrite jade, called known in a number of ways, but mainly as pounamu. I have a piece around my neck. It comes in 8 or 9 or 10 grades and types, and they all have names. But one of its features, apart from its lustrous beauty, is that it has voice. I'm accommodated Grange St Paul's, and I'm half tempted to hang out the window and add my penny's worth to the bells. But anyway, spectacular, and large sheets, we are told, were used of this and hung on trestles. And their duty was, in fact, to keep people awake when you're under siege. You've got people trying to clamber over the walls of a fighting pāwhawhai, and they're trying to get in. You had to keep people awake. So this was one method, as said, by which they did that. And of course, it was tough times. You got several hundred people of your iwi, your tribe, your hapu, crammed in a room not much bigger than this. Water and food become a huge necessity, and the people outside knew that. So keeping awake and keeping alert was that, and so this was known as a pahu pounamu. Now I showed you the puoro, the mamai, the commonly called in English bull roarer, and they're common throughout the world, seem to have generally two functions. They either drew spirits to the community or pushed them away. And as I explained, this one is very much benign. It's the voice of the mother. And I'm getting racing underway now. Here's another of these diminutive instruments. Many of these instruments weren't about audiences at all, about having listeners and so on. It really was a private practice communication with either tangata, either Aotearoa, these two states of being. And this is very private and intimate. So accompanying himself on these rods, which are known as pangaru, whakatangi, tangaru. Very effective, and in fact it's not bone, it's spindly branches of a mountain daisy called Olearia, tangaru. Right. We have one example of a stringed instrument. Now, having just worked in South Africa and going back shortly to record a couple of albums, I've been working with people who are the masters and geniuses of these. I don't know whether you've heard any South African mouth bows in action, or in fact the berimbau from Brazil. What they can do with these, with slightly altered strings and wire strings and so on, plus resonators that they put against their chest, nothing short of magic. These are slightly more diminutive than that, but if you listen carefully, you might be able to hear what they're capable of. Without a resonator, the minute you add a resonator in, so you've got this resonator in here and you can get 5, 6 harmonics. And I know it's very hard, and if I were in the audience I'd be doing what you're doing. Or making believe you can hear something, desperate to hear it and can't hear a thing. But we keep that up, we'll get feedback, and then the whole place will explode. Okay. If you know anything about traditional instruments, you'll know about a little flute that they have known as the puoro. And this is the instrument I sent those people, young children, away to work on and come back, and their girl came back and did that. They're quite extraordinary. They're end blown, cross blown, end blown, and 3-finger holes usually, although in fact I am trying to dissuade people from spending too much time trying to make finger holes work, because if you watch my fingers, I'm not using any finger holes at all. And with the smaller instruments you're able to do that. Once you start going into finger holes it becomes quite clunky. But the microtonal thing I was talking about, so it's just made for replicating the kind of song forms that you just heard me singing a little of. It's perfect for that, because I think the technical word is melisma, where you slide around and backwards and forwards and cross over bar lines. Not that the bar lines have any reference in Maori music. Now this is an example of a traditional flute. This is made from dog bone, kuri, and lots of other, well there weren't many animals actually. There was a tiny rat called kiori, and virtually no other mammals. There was no way you could make a flute out of a bat. We had two little bats, and there was the rat and the dog, and this one here. And without doubt, in terms of bone materials, the most used material, and if you went down the road next weekend and went and looked at the Hall of Mankind, looked at the Maori collection, there would be several bone flutes in there. The only other type of bone would be puoro, albatross, or human bone, particularly the femur here. And the old people had a way of describing that as how is it? He reo koiui tangata hei tino reka. The human bone had the sweetest voice of all, and I'm sure they're being metaphoric as well. Okay, dog bone. A lot of the knowledges of all of these has gone, and we are now trying slavishly to work out. And this is a wood, beautiful hardwood in the world, in fact, known as Mäori. It has the same, a good piece of hardwood has the same specific gravity as steel, and it floats under the water. But very beautiful, different sound, warm sound again. So it's organic, and you don't hear, if you played it using the finger holes, and it ends up sounding like a recorder and a 5 or 6 year old playing it. So that's, you play it like you hear the old people sing, something like it's a very old song, national anthem of Tainui people, Hore Patu Hau. The people in the audience here who know these songs and are not singing with me. Okay, so it's a technique, it's a crossbone technique here. It's different from the embouchure, side embouchure of flutes. Makes a very much more gentle sound, and really absolutely, well, the early literature as I described, poor flutes, poor trumpets, hardly worthy of study, hardly worth of playing. In actual fact, the reverse is true. I believe these to be, given the song form, the restricted song form of Multiete, I believe these to be sophisticated design vehicle for the musical form for which they're created. That they're utterly magical and ideal and perfect. They have an organic feel to them that's a kind of a visceral clutch that reaches right inside you. And talking to many Kiwis, many New Zealanders, many people in Aotearoa, they hear something, and there's a lot of it to hear now on the radio, and they say, oh, that's beautiful, I don't know what it is, but it could come from nowhere else. It could come from nowhere else but New Zealand. And that's the feeling that's held about them. And this is Pākehās, Europeans, and Maori. They know it's a sound from the land. They could come from nowhere else. So, interesting about these, with this, it's hard for some of you down the back, certainly would be for me, but there's an exquisite piece of carving done on here. Have a look at these later when we're finished. We're beginning to think that in fact these were presentation items to people like George Grey, Governor of New Zealand, and so on, and that the real working items were so quickly made from hollow woods like tutu and faux and a variety of natives we have. Cut, push the gunky stuff outside, play for the ritual that was needed, on the move, throw away. As kind of a working item that was really literally could be made as quick as that and thrown away, which would explain why there's none in the museums, and would explain why there are fair numbers of very exquisitely beautiful instruments like this that don't seem to have any whakapapa, family tree, explanation and so on, and seem to may well have been presentation items to the people who, as the Maori said of the missionary, ask you to pray to the heavens while they pulled the land out from under your feet. Other kinds of materials, very quickly. There are some that have been made very expertly in stone, and stone of course has its own distinct voice. Now we move into other kinds of flutes, and there are many. Here's a funny little thing made from the neck of a gourd. I don't know what you call them over here, but pumpkin-like vegetable with hard-shelled fruits. What's the other name for them? Ipu hure is a variety of Maori name, but this is the neck of a gourd anyway, and it's an instrument known as the Ororuarangi, and you just lay your hands across here on there, and I think it's styled after a style of singing that we know, or we have spoken of in Tuwharetoa, which is a tribal group, where the men sang in a very high-pitched falsetto, a countertenor, and it fell away in the early 19th century, but the Hawaiians do it. And some of you will be familiar with a Man Mountain glorious singer called Izzy, who died 6 or 8 years ago, a very beautiful singer. I think Somewhere Over the Rainbow was a remake of his that everybody got excited about, including Shell Oil. But the sound, beautiful. Starting to race, conscious of time, want to leave some time for questions. Here's a I should talk about this one. Now this very exquisite piece is not native bone, it is in fact ostrich femur, but very beautifully carved. But it's an example of an instrument that we only discovered several years ago, about 6 weeks before the old man died who was telling us about it. See, there's instruments that have never made it into the museums, and on 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 occasions have been residing in the memory of the very old. I said, I remember my mother saying, and I don't know what it meant, but well, we're carrying a lot of these fragments, and suddenly synaptic jumps between other information 300 miles away or other island and so on. This is talking about an instrument known as the puoro. Now the puoro is the baby's fontanelle. I know there's 2, but this is the posterior, anterior. Anyway, the forward one. And the puoro remains open, believe it or not, or takes 22 months to ossify. And Maori would, in fact, from the moment of birth, use this instrument in certain areas to play directly into the fontanelle. Stories, songs, genealogies, wishes and hopes and desires for the child directly into that open fontanelle. So you've had an educational concept going on for about nearly 2 years, and I think that's stunning. And we nearly lost that. We got the last bit of information from this old gentleman about 4 weeks before he died. Anyway, the sound of it is quite peculiar. It's only got one finger hole, one note. Based mainly around the harmonic series. It's quite flexible. You've got 5 or 6 opportunities there, pitch bending in here and so on, and all in the aid of passing this knowledge musically into the newborn baby. which I think, as I said, stunning. Another little interesting instrument is the nuru, which in this case is made from a sperm whale's tooth, another of the instruments that are basically banned for movements around the world. So here's the tooth. It's a really big item. This is a sperm whale's tooth. And an equally spectacular one, shaped like a tooth, but in actual fact is made from the cochlea of a bull humpback whale. And what I like about this one is the notion that this was receiving sound 5-6 kilometres below the ocean, now emits it, and the resonance of that I think is amazing. My carver friend said it's the hardest bone he's ever carved, and another friend of mine has written a book on whales and sonic uses of sonic apparatus that they have, and he's been working with scientists who have found that the humpback bull can emit a sound that is the loudest sound of any living creature, and a humpback bull can make himself heard 1,000 miles away just with a sonic blast. So absolutely extraordinary. I know water's a good conductor, but 1,000 miles? Ooh, really something. Right, the last little road to home is an instrument that I have kept to the end because it is so important. It's the puorino. It's important because it has a variety of functions, which I'll explain as we go, and it's also more important than anything because it's the home of the goddess of flute music, Whenua. Now she's a flightless female. This is her case. She's a case, she's in her temporal life, she's a case moth, and as a flightless female she stays in here all her life, drags herself around Tarzan and Jane-like on threads of spun threads. And when it is said when she wants to entertain a mate, she comes to the top of the cocoon and sings in the most pure flute-like voice. On the flip side, I know of no other instrument in any indigenous culture that is both a trumpet and in some instruments turned and becomes a flute. The trumpet is male, the flute is female. You can play from the centre here. You can play a series of spirit voices from here, and all up about 7 different functions, and I don't know of any instrument that can summon up those variety of ways of being. Here's the kōkiri, the male voice, the trumpet. Add spirit voice into that, which is, well, you'll recognise it, I think the current musical term is multiphonic. And the flute voice, I'll switch to another instrument because it has such a Ferrari-like sound. Here's a very small version of the puorino, highly decorated and highly carved, and an exquisitely beautiful voice. Female, Tuwharetoa. Another kind of spirit voice is what I call sonic icicles. I use it in the recordings here, but it's part of the puorino tradition and part of this whole idea of spirit voice, of rangiru, aururu, irirangi, a whole lot of things that the people intuited in the forest, frightened them, the taonga would use to do matters of matakite and foresight and so on. So here's the these sonic icicles. We persevered with that sound. We initially thought it was a fault in any of the instruments we were making, but I came across, it was a piece of kōrero that spoke about Hiniro Katori and her daughter Wheke being responsible for the mysterious and inarticulate sounds of the forest. And if you know the New Zealand bush, that kind of squeaky sound going is very much part of that. And it was used by the tohunga in the absence of the bush speaking. Sometimes it went very still and he needed to know things, and then they could set up applications like that. And apart from other ways of playing it from the centre and so on, the one that intrigues me most is the oldest. And round on the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand is an area called Ngāti Porou, Te Taitawhiti, and further into the country near to the sacred mountain, Hikurangi, is a marae called Tewe Eru. Now Tewe Eru is a ringatu marae, which is an extraordinary staunch group of people who stick to their very old ways, particularly in terms of worship. It's what technically anthropologists would call a cargo cult, but that diminishes it completely. It's a very extraordinary thing. But they had a way of playing this instrument which I find still frightens me. They had a technique in here which metamorphoses the voice, morphs it, and changes it all around. And it's done by singing directly into the instrument and letting the sound be released from this centre voice here. This is a fragment of a very old song. And that whole inward sounding being released from here, they said, was like an old man singing or an old person singing from a great distance and letting the sound of the voice bubble up through a bubbling spring, and that containment in there and so on. I can quite frighten myself sometimes with that. 3-4 minutes to go. Nō reira whakamutanga o preto vitu kōrero, nō reira tēnā koutou. Questions? There's a couple of them must be in there somewhere, and well, I have to shut this down at 7 o'clock. He told me and said I'd never be invited back if I went past him. All right, we've got a question. Yes, that's very loud. It's very powerful. No, it's not that it hurts, but it's probably the loudest instrument I have. Any questions?
The little stick things that you was playing, and you said it wouldn't be played in front of an audience. What was the reason?
It's not so much played in front of an audience as that the work that the tohunga did was regarded as spiritually private, separated, and a lot of the ordinary rank and file in any traditional community, it seemed, were cheery about, semi-frightened and anxious about things to do with the spiritual domain. And they had all sorts of restrictions. For instance, traditional people weren't allowed to whistle because in fact it was regarded that spiritual information was received through the ear and often at night, and to go around was really upsetting to the community. Little things like that. But it was generally the emphasis on spiritual activity and spiritual domain, which was the preserve of the taonga that I keep talking about. They didn't want any part of it. they needed him and they knew it was necessary, but they didn't want to be part of it themselves. And so a lot of that work he was doing was essentially intimate and private, as I understand. Anybody else? We must be nearly there. Yes, sir.
Traditionally, would any of the instruments be combined into ensemble play?
Really good question. As far as we know, not. The ensemble that you probably got was instrument and voice, or voices. It was a very rare thing for traditional community to sing alone. That in fact they largely clustered together and supported each other. And in the breathing, the feeling was that they had to maintain the ha, the ho, through the integrity of the song. So they would take breaths at different points and the song just carried on. And if you did ever find yourself in the difficult situation of having to sing alone and having nobody with you, you didn't conform to bar lines or any of those things. You sang and sang and sang till you hyperventilated, grabbed a breath and finished. And it was a pretty parlous thing to be alone.
Could you elaborate more on the spirit voice?
Spirit voice, it's a very difficult one. Some of the ways in which the taonga accessed the spiritual domain was in fact to imitate and to invigorate it into other sounds. So from this as a trumpet, you could include spirit voice into there. By adding your voice in. Multiphonics. All right, a lot of trombone and trumpet players can do it and so on and so forth. There were various names for it: Aotearoa, Rangirua, Irirangi. They were all ways of naming sonic qualities in the bush or the beach and the sea that appeared to come just to be evoked from the land itself. And the taonga would practice with those and use those to see if he couldn't get a steer on what the tribe should be doing, which direction they should go, should they retreat, should they advance, those kind of things. And when you sometimes play this instrument and another instrument, you get a third voice that seems to combine. There'll be a good physical, musical reason for that. But partly that's why it's called a pu torino. Pu, trumpet, torino in three voices. Oh, there's so much I mean, so that's the introduction. But anyway, I think we're going to have to call it a day there. Yes, he did it. Yeah.
I wasn't going to say, but I think you said that's an absolutely fascinating demonstration and talk, and thank you very much indeed, Richard. I know Richard will be here for a little longer if anyone wants to ask any more questions and have a look at the instruments, I'm sure. And also, obviously, do join us for a drink next door, which I believe is called the Headmaster's Study. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you very much indeed, Richard. Thank you.